So in this session, we will deep dive into some hands-on into the core connectors, and we'll take one example and we'll try to create one integration and see how we can build the core connector and generate an output file. Okay. So let me share my screen. Okay. So now we have logged into our tenant. So as we discussed in our previous session, so core connectors are the first preferred integration types where if for any given requirement, we have to evaluate the core connectors first to see if the requirement can be met using the core connectors. Now, so again, when we were discussing in our beginning sessions, there are two types of core connectors that are available. One is the point-to-point end-to-end connectors, and the other are the custom connectors. So, for example, I will first show you what is the end-to-end or point-to-point connector. So, for example, for any integration, if you want to create an integration, there is a task called create integration system. So once you click on that, it will ask you few details. So first, we need to give what should be your integration system name. So for example, I am giving u underscore November 24 underscore P2P demo. Okay. I'm just giving this as the integration system name. And there is something called system ID that will be unique to each integration system, and that will be auto-populated from your name. And if needed, you can change it. And in the comment, you can give a brief description about what this integration is. For example, let's say we are building this integration for any third-party system. Okay. So third-party. So this integration sends data from Workday to some third-party system. And optionally, you can also specify any tags that you want to tag. For example, if this integration deals with payroll data, you can optionally add payroll tag as well. This is not mandatory, but for the ease of maintenance and for further reporting, you can try to add tags to each integration system. And this will be especially useful when there are a lot of integrations systems in your tenant. And these tags will help identify how different integration systems are grouped for each domain or each area. Then you have contacts. This is also optional. If you want, you can add. Otherwise, you can skip. And now comes the main part, template. So here, for point to point, now if you see here, you have two options. Either you can choose a template from category, or you can say all integration templates. Once you click on that, as you can see here, a lot of predefined templates are getting populated. So as you can see here, for example, these are ADP connectors. So which means, for example, if ADP is your third-party payroll vendor, let's say, and you want to send data from Workday to ADP, then you can look at some of these predefined connectors that are available for ADP, if this fits the requirement. If this doesn't satisfy the requirement, then we need to go with custom integration, which we will see in the later part. So as you can see here, some of this is for Emeritus, this is for Blue Cross Blue Shield. So like this, there are several P2P integrations that are available. So for example, I'll select this one. I want to send Workday data to Cigna, for example. Then I can select Cigna and I'll say OK. So once you click on OK, you will be able to see it asks you to enable all services. So each integration system has these integration services that we need to configure. You can see some of the services are enabled by default and we do not have an option to change them. So these are coming from the connector itself. So the only options that we have to configure are highlighted here in this column, enabled column. These can be configured depending on the need. So for this connector, if you want to, for full file, if you want to include the end coverage only once, then you can enable it. Otherwise, you can skip it. Similarly, for debug service, if you want to enable the debug mode, you can enable this or you can ignore it. So depending on the template that you have selected, these integration services will vary. Okay. We'll talk about these different integration services as we move along and when we discuss about custom integrations. Okay. So once you enable the required services, then you can click on OK. Once you click on OK, as you can see, the integration system is created in the tenant. It shows the details like the name, template, what is the description, along with the services that we have enabled. And also, as and when you created, it is showing an initial error, which means what it says is there are integration attributes enabled for this integration system that are marked as required for launch but do not have a value assigned. Please use the related menu item to configure attributes to complete this configuration. So what it is saying is, for this integration system, there is a required attribute which is blank. That is why it is showing an error. And this is that attribute name that it is saying. And this is the service name that it is showing. So now how we can remove this error is by navigating to this service and configuring this attribute. So let's try to do that. So if you see here, there are different tabs. First tab is the integration attributes. So whenever we create a new integration system, we will have to make sure that these integration attributes are configured as per the requirement. So how do you know what values that you need to configure for these attributes? So that has to be discussed with your technical lead, or if you are directly interacting with the business or the vendor who is Cigna in this case, then you will have to talk to them and get the information on what values that you need to configure for each of these attributes. Attributes again are different based on the template that you have selected. So for example, if you have selected ADP as a template, then you will be seeing different other attributes than the one that are displayed here, because these attributes are specific to the vendor Cigna. Okay. So the other attributes that you do not see any required value here, these are all optional attributes. As I mentioned, these needs to be configured after discussing with the businesses and the vendor. But the one where it says required for launch, we have to mandatorily populate a value. This also you will discuss with the business on what attribute that you need to configure. So for example, this connector that we have selected is a benefit end-to-end connector. So this benefit connector works purely on the benefit plans. Benefit plans are the source for this connector template to pick up the data from Workday. That is the reason it is asking what are the benefit plans that it should extract. So how you can configure these values. You can go to the related actions of the integration system and click on configure integration attributes. Once you click, it will open up this window. Here you can do a plus and select the different values that you would want to include. Okay. And on the right hand side, as you can see, there is one more optional attribute that you can configure that says restricted to environment. So what this means is that you can configure different values when your integration runs in different environments. Like for example, let's say these values I have configured and I want to test these only in the dev environment. So I can select, for example, either dev. I want to have different values that the integration needs to pick up when it runs in production. Then I can select production and assign these two values. That's the functionality of the restricted to environment. Otherwise, you can remove the restrictions. If you want to test with the same plans in all the environments, you can simply remove the restrictions and save it. Now you see, after saving, the page error got disappeared and the benefit plans got added here. Okay. Since this is the only required attribute for this integration, I've configured that. Likewise, if there are any other required attributes, like for example, this one, document retention policy, which is the common attribute that you would see in any connector, is also required and it defaulted to 30 days. What this means is that whenever the integration runs, the output file that it generates, it says how many days that the file should be accessible in the tenant. So here, by default, it is 30. If needed, we can change it. Since it is already populated, I'm not going to change it for now. So my integration is saved. The other tab that you see here are the integration maps. So integration maps, these you will typically configure for any vendor-based point-to-point integrations. So these will be useful for your Workday system to vendor system mapping. For example, in Workday, you may have a marital status value like married or single as a text field. But on Cigna side, they might maintain it as a numerical values. So you have to map your Workday value with the value what Cigna expects. For that reason, you will use integration maps. Again, these maps, you have to discuss with the vendor what mappings that you need to configure for each of these fields. So let's see how you can configure integration maps. Same way, go to the related actions, integration system, and configure integration maps. So here, if you see, for example, for demonstration purpose, let's take the example of marital status. So I'm adding one value. Now, for example, the vendor says for single, and for Argentina, if the country is Argentina, and if the value is single, I need value of, let's say, S. Then I can select here. And sometimes they will say for maybe, let's pick divorced, they might ask to give a different value. Then we can select the value. Now you can see there is, depending on the vendor, these values are automatically coming up in this list. So this is what the functionality of the point-to-point connectors. Now, in this case, Cigna accepts only S or M. That's the reason you are not seeing any other values to map here. So this is what we call as a minimal configuration and point-to-point connector. So now here you see there is one more option that it is asking to select, which is the default value. Now what this means is that if Workday has any other value other than these two, for example, married or separated or any other value, then what is the value this field should send? Because we haven't mapped that value here. So it picks up the default value. So let's say I selected as S. So which means if there is a value for any worker other than these two, then it has to send S. So I selected S. Similarly, you can add different mappings for each of these other fields and you can save. So once you save it, when you go back to the integration maps, you will see those maps are getting reflected here. Okay. So these are the two important features of any connector. Now, since you have configured the required attributes and the required maps, now your integration is ready. That's all. So now, whenever you launch this integration, we will see more about how to run the integration, how to schedule it to run as a batch job, what is the output of it. We will see that when we discuss about the custom connectors, but typically this is how you build the end-to-end or the point-to-point vendor specific templates or integrations. So there might be some cases where once you create this integration system using a vendor specific template, sometimes vendor may expect few additional data apart from what this connector already generates. There can be some exceptions as well. So in those cases, there is one service called field override service that is usually available in almost all the connectors that we will configure. So we will talk about the field override service as well when we talk about the custom connectors. But at this point, just try to remember that in case the vendor needs additional data than the default data that this connector already generates, then we can do that as part of field overrides. And some of these other common services we will discuss when we talk about the custom connectors. So now this is about integration template or the point-to-point connector. Now let's talk about a very basic connector, very basic custom connector, which will be used mostly around 80% of the cases. So let's say in this case, Cigna says that whatever the data that this connector is generating is not sufficient or that is not as per their new standards. It could be that this connector might be old dated. Or another good example or good use case is that let's say there is a vendor called XYZ and that vendor doesn't have any delivered integration template or a delivered connector that is already available like we have for Cigna or ADP. Then how do you create the integration system for that vendor? So that's when our custom core connectors will come into picture. Okay. Now let's see how do we create a custom core connector. So again, as usual, when you want to create a new integration system, you will have to go to the task, create integration system and say enter. Okay. Now let me select create integration system. So here, if you observe here, it is the same task that we used to create our packaged connector or the point-to-point connector. So here, let me enter a name. For example, u underscore number 24 underscore, let's say ccw underscore demo. The other attributes are same. So I'm going to skip through those other attributes. Now, you see here, the reason I mentioned here as a ccw, because the basic or the very common connector that we typically use to send the data to any vendor system is core connector worker. That is the most basic connector that gives us the necessary information about a worker demographic and job related data. So CCW is the core connector worker. Okay. So in the integration template here, you can type connector worker. As you can see, there are two connectors, core connector global worker and core connector worker. So we will have to select core connector worker and select OK. Now when you see here, this is also similar to what we have seen in the point-to-point connector. So it will ask us to configure any additional services. So if you see here, some of these services got added when we selected core connector worker template instead of the vendor specific template. So these are some predefined services. As you can see, this one is selectable, but the other one was non-selectable. So this one, what it means is that whenever you are pulling a huge data, then Workday has some inbuilt functionality called DIS, which is a data initialization service that you can select so that for high volume integrations, this connector can run considering performance into account. So if you are dealing with high volume data, then you can enable this attribute. Otherwise, you can ignore. So let's talk about few important services that are available and how can we use them. So as you see here, this is one of the important service that is available in the core connector worker, which is the date launch parameters. And this date launch parameter service, if you see, this is not editable, which means this is a mandatory service for the core connector and it is enabled by default. So which means is that we will go through this date launch parameter service in detail when we try to launch our integration system. Okay. So then the next one we have is the integration maps. We already discussed about integration maps when we saw our previous packaged connector. So similar to that, here also we can configure integration maps between Workday and Workday data and the XYZ vendor systems data. So based on the XYZ vendors system, we can configure a number of integration maps. So this is also enabled by default and we will not be able to change. Few of them, these are not important. And the another important service is the eligibility service. So this is again when we discussed in our previous session. So for any core connector, eligibility is what determines what data or what workers it has to select. So in our previous example, the eligibility was determined based on the benefit plans because that connector was for a benefit vendor and it works based on the plans. So there we did not had any specific eligibility service. But whereas this connector, this is not specific to any vendor. It is a common connector. So we have to configure the eligibility to identify what population this connector should select and generate the file, send the data to the XYZ system. So we will see how we can configure the eligibility. The next important service is the delivery service. So what this means is that once the integration runs and it generates a file, so that file we have to send it to the XYZ system. So for that, we have to enable the delivery service. That is where we configure all the server related details to indicate where the file has to be sent so that the XYZ system can access the file from that server. We will see in the demo how we will configure this. And as you can see here, this is not enabled by default, but we can enable it if we want to send the file to the vendor system. So let me select. And the next important service is the transaction log service. This also, when we were discussing in the previous session, this plays another important role, ability criteria in worker records that needs to be selected as part of this integration. So for example, in the eligibility criteria, let's say I have populated saying that it has to pick all US employees. And within that, I can also configure this transaction log service to indicate that to capture only the new hires, new hire events, or I can say to exclude the new hire events and capture everything else. So those kind of event-based rules we can configure using the transaction log service. So we will see how we can configure this. So for now, I'm going to enable it. And the next important attribute is the sequence generator. Now, sequence generator is something related to the file name. So let's say you have scheduled this integration as a batch job to run on a daily basis. So whenever this integration runs, it generates a file, and that file we will send it to the server using the delivery service, and that file should have a name. So that name we can configure dynamically to have the name generated using this service. So you can append the date and timestamp to the file name to indicate when that file was generated. So we will see that how can we configure. So I'm going to enable it. And another important attribute is the document retention. So in our previous packaged connector, you might have observed this document retention was already enabled by default. But here we can choose to have this either enabled or disabled. So I can make it enabled for now. The next set of services are all related to the data section fields. So which means depending on the data that you want to include in your integration system, you can enable these services. So what it means is that, for example, in my integration system, based on the vendor requirement, let's say the vendor says they need personal data. Some of the fields information related to the name, marital status, gender, and all, date of birth. So I need to enable this in order to send the data. So similarly, if I want to send position related data as well, the job profile, the job related data, the time type, and all. So I can enable this section as well. So like that, depending on the data that your vendor needs, you can select any of these services. Okay. So now I have selected some of the key services and I am going to save it. As you can see here, again, whenever you saved, the usual error pops up to configure the required attributes, which is this in this case, which is the version. Okay. So let me close this pop-up and let's try to configure this mandatory attribute. So let's try to do that. Integration system, integration, configure integration attributes, and this is the required attribute. I'll do a plus. And whenever you are configuring the version, make sure to select the latest version always. So in this case, the latest available version is 40. So I have selected 40 and I'll just scroll down to see if there are any other required attributes that you need to configure. Here's one, which is the document retention policy that we discussed. So here by default it is 30, but my business or my client says it has to be, let's say, 60 days or 50 days. Then I can override this behavior and I can select the number of days and I can save it. So as you see here, the attributes maps are pretty much related to what we saw on the packaged connector. But the only difference is here you have a lot more attributes than you saw on or even the integration maps. There are 56 maps. So which means since this custom connector is not based on these attributes or maps will be common, so that you need to configure only the ones that are required by the specific vendor that you are working with. For example, few vendors may say that they need the home address type. Then here instead of work, you need to configure home. Few vendors say they need only work. Then you can leave this attribute as usual. So the same thing. A few vendors prefer only home phone information. In that case, you have to change this value to home. So based on that requirement specific to each vendor, you have to configure these attributes accordingly. But the only thing here is that for each of this attribute, you need to discuss with the vendor on what value they are expecting. So these are different attributes that you can configure. And there are a couple other attributes, like, for example, required field validation. So this will tell you what should happen when any of the required field is missing a value. So you can say either omit the record and report it as a warning, or omit the record but report it as an error. Based on this configuration, your integration will work accordingly. Few other attributes where if you want to disable or suppress some of the default logs that this core connector generates, which we will see those logs when we run this integration. So sometimes when your integration runs for huge population, it can generate a lot of background files. So if you want to suppress those files, then you can enable these two attributes so that those logs or those system message audit files will be disabled or they will not be generated. Okay? And this is another attribute. We will talk about full file and change file. So for now, just remember there is one attribute for transaction log full file, and we will see it later. And you can configure the job type and the retention policy. So that's all it is. And integration maps as well. If you see, you can configure the name type, title, gender, marital status, so several other mappings that you can configure. Okay. Now, so we have configured the integration attributes. We have configured the integration maps. Now, what is the next step? Now, you will have to determine what is the exact data or what is the exact filter criteria that you want to apply for this integration. So, as we discussed in the previous session, there are multiple ways through which this core connector worker will pick up the data from Workday. So the first thing that we discussed was the transaction log. So let's see how to configure the transaction log. Go to the related actions of this integration system, and then you will see an option to configure integration transaction log. Once you click on that, you will see this is the default transaction log that has been enabled for this core connector. So there are a couple of options here. So subscribe to specific transaction types means, if in our case, like I was mentioning before, if you want this connector to pull only the new hire events, only the new hire transactions, then you can click on this checkbox that will allow you to edit this particular section, and you can select which business processes that you want to include in your core connector, like for example, hire. And the next option is subscribe to all business processes. So which means irrespective of the transaction, it can be a hire, it can be a termination, can be a job change, irrespective of the transaction, it will pick up all business processes. And the next option is subscribe to all business process types except these events. So for example, if I selected absence case event here, and if any worker has absence case event type, that will be ignored because it will subscribe to all business process except absence case. So that way you can configure these attributes depending on the requirement. So for this use case, I'm going to say subscribe to all transaction types. I need everything, and we'll save the data. Click on done. Now it took us to the create integration system home screen. So at any point you want to go back to your integration system, then you need to type int/sys your integration system name. So it will pull up only the integration systems. So you can select CCW and you will launch onto the integration system. The next important attribute for determining the population along with the transaction log is the eligibility criteria or the eligibility surveys that we have enabled. So how do we configure the eligibility? So let's say I go to the related action, integration system, and configure integration field overrides. So I click on that. As you can see here, this is where it will ask you to configure the eligibility criteria. So transaction log is the first level of filter. Within those transaction log, you can further drill down. You can further refine your filter by populating this eligibility criteria. So you can read the description here. I will pause here for a minute. So what this means is that this eligibility criteria should be a Boolean value, which means if you remember our discussion on calculated fields. We have created one calculated field type called true or false, which is a Boolean field. Here, it expects to have any Boolean value that should return true. Based on that Boolean value, it will determine the eligibility criteria. So, for example, I have subscribed to all transaction types in my transaction log. And now I decided I don't need any filter or any further refinement. I just need filter only on the transaction log. Then I can select here and type is true or any is. You can select both of them. Now, what it means is that this Boolean value always returns true. So, which means it doesn't do second level refinement. Instead, it will pick up based on the transaction log. Let's say if we want to add one more filter on top of the transaction log. So our transaction log says subscribe to all transaction types. But here, let's say I need only the employees under USA, only US employees. Then what we need to do here is instead of is true, we have to create a Boolean calculated field that says worker location should be USA. So before creating a calc field, let me see if someone has already created that calc field in the tenant so that I won't duplicate it. As you can see here, there are some examples that I got. So let's see what this is. The report field, country, region. Okay, this is also a report field, US citizenship. Maybe I can use this, but let's create a new calc field. So let me open a duplicate tab, cancel this. So I will go to the task, create calculated field, if you remember. So here I will say CF underscore worker. So again, just remember, we are creating this calc field. We have to choose a business object. Now this business object, as you can see here, it should be on one of these. Since I am looking up the worker data, so I will create on the worker object, worker business object. So I will select worker here. Let me complete the name, US employee, true, false. I just give some random name. And here in the first select true or false. Click on OK. Now here I will say work location. Do we have the work location? Or I will select country of birth. Let me see. Say work country, primary work address country. So let's see if this brings. I will say in the list, I will say USA and save it. So now my calc field is ready. This will evaluate if the work address is USA. So I'll copy this calc field. I'll go back to my eligibility and I will search here. Now it got populated. I save it and click on done. So my eligibility is configured. So two things are configured. One is the transaction log and the other is the eligibility. Third important parameter, that is called date launch parameters. So before we move on to the date parameters, we will discuss how to configure different data elements that we want to see in the output. So if you remember, in the integration services, we configured few data section fields, but we did not specify which specific field should be included. So let's try to do that. For that, the related action, integration system, and configure integration field attributes. So here, if you see, whatever the services that we have enabled, only those appeared here. So if you need to include more data, then you can go back to configure services and add relevant data section fields. Okay. So we are on the personal data section fields. So this will give you a brief description on what this data section contains. So this particular data section has 74 fields, 74 different attributes. If to, let's say, select all the fields, all personal data fields, then you can check this option and all these fields will be automatically included. Or if your requirement is to include only few of the data, then you can uncheck this and select only the fields that you need. Example, this one, I want to have country, and that's all. I can ignore the rest of the fields based on the vendor requirement. And as you can see here, there are a couple other attributes that you can optionally configure. This is a required field validation. Excuse me. So for this validation, let's say if the vendor says that the name data is required in their system, and typically most of the cases this will be there in Workday as well. But in cases, for any exceptional case where the data is missing in Workday and you want to error that record before sending it to the vendor system, then you can enable this attribute so that the connector will always make sure the name data, or if you say, for example, birth date, where is that? If I selected birth date as well, then it will make sure the birth date is always there for the worker. If not, it will error out based on the attribute that we selected in the integration attributes section. Okay. And the other option is the maximum length. So sometimes vendors have specific requirement saying that they can accept only a certain length values. For example, let's say city of birth. They might say that they will accept not more than 35 characters. Then, without erroring it in the vendor system, you can configure the maximum length and the integration will automatically truncate this value and it will be shared in the output. Okay. So that is how this data section fields will work, and we can select different fields from the data sections. Let me select few other data fields from the position. So this operation, if you see, it is by default enabled and we do not have an option to disable it, because whenever a position is added, removed, modified, this operation will tell you what exactly that has been happened to that position. So in position, I will say I need the position title, or the business title, and the time type, and the weekly hours, and the pay rate type. That's all. I don't need any of the other data. So I can click on OK. As you can see here, whatever I have selected, those have been enabled. So this is how you will configure what specific data elements that you need to send it to the third party system. Okay. Now, let's say your third party vendor needs some data that is not available in any of these services. Okay. Now, in those cases, how do you include that data as part of this integration? So that is when you will add integration field overrides. So let's see how to add the field overrides. Go to the related action, go to the integration system and click on configure integration field overrides. So click on this. As you see here, right now, we do not have an option to add any other override other than the eligibility criteria. This is because we have to do one prerequisite before we add other data elements. So let me cancel this. We go to the integration system and go to configure integration services. We'll click on that. So as you can see here, there is a section called custom integration service. So this is where you will add and you will create a new integration field override service. So in this list, select create integration field override service, click on it and give it a name. So I'll follow same naming convention, say field overrides, and the business object should always be worker because we are reporting on the worker date. Now, let's say I need to pass, or let's say I have one, what do you call, national ID, for example, which is not available. And if I want to include it in the connector, so I can type, this is just a name. So you can type a free text and provide any description if you would like. So like that, you can add any values here that you want to optionally add. These are already there in the existing services, but just for the sake of demo, I'm just adding this here to show you how we can add any data that is not available in the existing services. So once you add a name, once you add the list of names here, save the field override service. Click on OK again. So as you can see here, your service got saved. Now you need to go back to the related action, integration system. Now again go back to configure integration field overrides. Now you see here the new service that we added is appearing here. Now once you click on this here, it will ask you to select what is the value for each of these fields. So again, here, either you can select any Workday delivered value, or you can create a calc field based on your requirement. There can be some complex requirements as well. You may need to build multiple chain of calc fields. Like, for example, if you want to extract the effective date of the latest compensation change event. How do you do that? You will have to build a series of calculated fields and get that value. Once you get that value, add that calc field here. So that is how you perform complex calculations and add those new data elements as part of the field override service. For time being, for the demo purpose, we'll try to see if we have any existing values that are available. We do. So I will simply select this. If not, as I mentioned, you can always select any calculated. For example, this is one of the calculated field that we created for our reporting purpose. So let me select one of it. Similarly, for phone number, let me see if we have any calc fields. Yeah, there are a lot of calc fields. I don't know if these will return phone numbers as such, but just for the sake of demo, I selected some random field. Now I've assigned the respective values to each of these fields, custom fields, and I will click on OK. Now if you go back to field overrides, you will see all those fields assigned to our fields. So click on done. The custom fields are configured. So at any point, if you want to view either the selected data section fields or the field overrides, you can do so by navigating to related actions, integration system. You see, there is an option to view integration field overrides or view integration field attributes. You can click any one of them and it takes you to the view only screen for a quick confirmation. Similarly, you can also view field overrides. So this is how you configure the data elements. Now, let me go back to the integration system. So we have configured services, we have configured attributes, we have configured maps, and then we have selected we have configured the transaction log, we have configured the eligibility criteria, we have selected the different data elements, we have also added custom fields. So now we should be good to launch the integration system. So there are two ways to run this integration system. Now, first way is to run manually, and the second way is to schedule it as a batch. So as part of the testing, typically you will run the integration manually whenever you want to run it. But when you migrate it to production, you will schedule this. We will see that how to do it. So we will schedule this integration on a defined frequency so that it runs automatically. Okay. So let's see how to launch the integration system. Go to the related actions and option called integration, and then click on launch/schedule. Once you click, it will asks you to determine the frequency. Since we are just testing this, we are not scheduling, I will select run now. If I want to schedule this as a batch job, I can select one of these options. For now, I select run now, click on OK. Now, here comes the important part. Once you click on run now, as you can see, there are a couple parameters that got appeared. So these parameters, as you can see here, these are coming from the one of the service that's enabled on the integration system, which is the date launch parameters. So if you remember, the way the core connector works is based on three parameters. One is the transaction log, which acts as the first level filter. Second, the eligibility criteria, which acts as the second level filter. And the third is this date launch parameters, which act as the third level filter. So whenever you try to debug the integration in order to identify why the data or why the employees are picking up or why the employees are not picking up, then you have to evaluate all these three filter criteria: transaction log, eligibility criteria, and date launch parameters as well. So let's take a look at the date launch parameters and see the importance of this. As you can see, there are 4 different date parameters that it is asking us to enter. As of entry moment, effective date, last successful as of entry moment, last successful effective date. So what this means is that it is asking to enter a specific date or date timestamp values so that it will identify the transactions only during that defined date range. Okay. So again, before talking about these date parameters, so there are 2 ways that the core connector worker integration will run. One is based on a full file mode. Second is based on a change detection mode. So 90% of the use cases are with change detection and only very less scenarios are with full file. Now, what is the difference between a change detection approach versus full file approach? So let's say your vendor needs full snapshot of the data every day. So it doesn't matter how many changes happened. It doesn't matter how many transactions happened. Your vendor says, always send me a full dump of the data so that they can override everything in their system on a daily basis. So in that case, you will go with the full file option. We will see how to run the integration in full file. Now, the second use case is sometimes the vendor says, I don't need the full dump of data every day. Instead, I only need the incremental changes. So which means an employee is hired, then send only that record to my system. Do not send any other records where there are no changes. And if there are few employees that got terminated or few employees that had name change, then the vendor says only send those changed data. Do not send the full dump. In that case, we will go with change detection method. And now let's see how to launch the integration in full file mode and how to launch the integration in change detection mode. So as you can see here, so let's say in the first use case, we want to launch the integration in a full file mode. Then you see here, there is an option called full file. So first you have to check the checkbox so that it knows it needs to run in full file mode. And second, as you can see here, some of the dates have been auto defaulted. We'll come to the specifics of each of these dates. But as of now, just consider that we will mostly give the current date. So this is the current date timestamp. This is the current date, and I checked for full file. Now, so once you click on OK, it starts running in the background and you can see the status of it and you can see the time it is taking, and you can also refresh it and monitor the event. So let's wait until this event gets completed and then we will review the output. Okay, it is still running. As you can see here, it ran up till 99%, it took 58 seconds, and it got 32 errors. It is completed. Now the status is completed with errors. If there are no errors, it will just say completed, and it shows the time. And once you click on these errors, it will tell you what are all the different errors that it received. As you can see, most of these, for example, if you see no output value for required field birth date for so-and-so employee. Now, if you remember, as part of our integration field attribute configuration, we enabled the validation saying that the date of birth is needed. But for all of these employees, the date of birth is blank. That's why the integration did not include these employees into the output and it errored out. Now, if you scroll further down below, if you want to see more logs, you can retrieve more logs, click on OK, and you will get more detailed logs and see what information it has in the backend. So other than that, this is how the completed event looks like. It shows you what parameters we gave when launching the integration. So let's move on to the other tabs. So before moving on to the other tabs, you see here, it shows who is the person who initiated this, and it ran as the same person. This info, it shows some more details on the timings. If you go to process history, again, it shows the errors and warnings. And this is the important tab called the output files. So this is where you will see all the files that got generated by this integration. Now you can open these message audit files and you will be able to see for each worker what is the transaction that happened. So these are the detailed message audits that gets generated. And if you remember, as part of the integration attributes, let me open that up. We have one attribute called suppress audit reports or suppress worker messages audit. Right now, we are not suppressing. Next time when we try to do, we will suppress or we will add the value and launch the integration. Then we will not be able to see these audits. So you can enable or disable them as per your need. And then the other important file is the diagnostic audit file. So let me save it and let me open it. As you can see here, this diagnostic audit file will give you how many workers that got picked up based on the eligibility criteria. So remember that when you run the integration in full file mode, transaction log will be ignored. Only eligibility criteria will be considered when populating or selecting the worker records. So you can click on each of these worker records to see under which messages audit file this worker appeared. So this is one important file that we will to identify how many workers got selected in the integration system. And the other file that you see here, output.xml. So this is the final file that contains the actual data. So let me download this and we'll open it, and you see this is how the final file looks like. This is an XML file with the static header, static namespace. These are all Workday defined. Static header, it gives you the worker count and it gives you the details of each and every worker, the name, date of birth, marital status, whatever the fields that we have selected. You will also see these are grouped under different sections. Like this is all under personal, all the position is under different group. As you can see here, the title, period type, and you will notice this section called additional information. If you recollect, these are our additional or the custom data that we added on the field overrides. So whatever the fields that you add on the field overrides will be part of the additional information. And this format, summary or data sections and the field overrides will repeat for each and every worker. So if you keep scrolling down, there are different. This is the data for this particular worker. This is the data for this particular worker. And you will also see the eligibility. It says true. That is why this employee got picked up. So this is how the final output looks like. So let me close this. And the other file is the XSD, which we usually don't require it, but you can see the schema if you would like. Now, this is about the full file. Let's try to discuss the other method called the change detection method. So in order to capture only the changes, then when you launch your integration, so let me go back to the integration. This is our integration, and we'll click on related action, integration, click on launch schedule, again run now. If I want to launch the integration in change detection mode to detect only the changes, I should not select this full file. I did not, which is good. And I need to enter these date parameters. Based on these date parameters, the core connector will detect the changes or pick up the workers based on the transaction log and the eligibility criteria. So the first parameter is as of entry moment. So this determines when the entry has happened or the transaction has keyed in Workday. So this is basically talks about the range. So if you see here, this is the as of entry moment and the last successful entry moment. So these two timestamp values, if you observe, are these moments indicate when the transaction actually happened in Workday or entered in Workday. So let's say if I am making some change to a worker now, which is 28/11/29, this will become my entry moment for that transaction. So, for example, if I have changed a date of birth for any employee during this time, and if I want to include the transaction in my integration, then I need to make sure that date and time stamp whenever I have entered in Workday should fall in between these two ranges, in between last successful as of entry and as of entry moment. So this last successful as of entry moment actually acts as the start date time, and the as of entry moment actually acts as the end date and time. So what I will say, so the end date and time, obviously it has to default to the current system date and time. So I can just say determine value at runtime. I will select current moment, which is nothing but the end date, and the start date I will say let's pick from, which means from 6 a.m. until now, until the current moment, whatever the transactions that I have keyed in, pick up those transactions. Along with that, also consider when the transaction becomes effective, that we need to configure here. So which means the effective date, and I can give future date as well if I want to capture the future dated changes. So for now, I'll keep current date. Most of the cases we will use current date. And the last successful effective date is again the start date from which you have to look up the range. So I will say again here, maybe, so here what I'm saying is from until current moment, whatever the transactions that are keyed in, and if those transactions are effective within this date range from to, then only those transactions. Otherwise, do not pick up those transactions. Now let's see what happens when we launch our integration system with these parameters. So let's wait for some time. See if it got completed. It got completed. Now you see this time we have less errors. And let's see the output files tab. And I will open the output file. If you see this time, it did not pick up any worker. The count is 0. This is because from, if you go to the integration details tab, it will show you the launch parameters, what it picked up. So what it means is that from this moment to this moment, there were no transactions that have been keyed in, or even if you key in, those transactions might not be effective during this date range. That is the reason the integration did not pick up any worker record. Okay. Now let's try to do one transaction for any of the worker that we previously got in the file. So 1 second. So let me pick up some random person. Okay. So let's pick up this person, Max Millen Schneider. Now what we will do, we will try to change this person's personal data. For example, let's say edit personal information. I will change this guy's date of birth to 6/6/3 and I will save it. Now I will click on submit. I will approve it. I will log in as start proxy here and let me approve it. Okay, it got approved. And if you see, the timestamp is this one. So for that particular transaction, the timestamp, this will act as the entry moment that we are seeing here. So let me stop proxy and we'll try to launch the integration event again through the change detection mode. We'll go here, integration, launch schedule. There is also one other way you can actually launch schedule integration. Let me show you that. So in the search, you can directly type launch integration and the task will open up. And the only additional step here is you will have to select your integration system, and that's all. So if you try to observe here, as soon as you landed on this page, these dates got auto defaulted. Now how these dates got auto defaulted are based on the last run of this integration system. So it basically tries to capture when did this integration last ran and what parameters we gave in the last run. So those parameters will populate here. What is the last effective date? What is the last successful as of entry moment that we gave? And it will populate here by default. And it will always default these two to the current effective date and current timestamp. Okay, so that here now we have entered our transaction after the last integration run date, right? So our transaction should be included in this date range. So now let me try to run it and we will see. Let's see. It's completed. Now let's go to the output files. So yeah, let me save this. So now you see there is one worker got selected and that is the same worker that we made the change. Okay. Now, as you see here, it displays all that data. This is the value that we have changed. But if you notice here, although it gives the corrected or the updated value, and it also gave for which worker the data got updated, it is difficult to identify for vendor from this list what is the value that is actually updated. So for that, there is an option that we can enable to flag which data element got updated. So let's look at that. Let me use it. I will go back to my integration system. This is my integration system. And I will go to related actions, integration system, and configure integration attributes. Okay. If I scroll down, if you see here, there is an attribute called include prior values. So this option currently is disabled. That is the reason we are not able to see which data element got changed. Now, if we enable this attribute and save it, let's see how the output will vary. Now, what I will do now, if you closely observe, if I try to launch the integration again, it will try to fetch the data changes from our last integration runtime to current moment. When it tries to do that, it will be unable to output any worker because we haven't done any transaction since the integration last ran until till now. So I need to do another transaction and then launch the integration like we did for this scenario. Or for testing purpose, this will be useful when you test it during the development. Instead of keying the transaction every time, you can simply relaunch the same event with the same date timestamp parameter values to pick up the relevant employees. So how do you do that? For example, this is one of the event that we just ran. Now, I have changed something in the attribute and I want to test this integration for the same parameters. Then I need to go to this integration event. So we have to go to the related actions of the integration event, and inside integration event, you see the option relaunch integration event. Once you click on that, it will take you to the same screen with the same parameters populated automatically as the similar to the last event. So now I will simply say OK and we'll wait for the integration to get completed. Okay, let's see if it ran. It completed. Now let's go back and see what is the difference in our output file. Okay, now if you notice, for date of birth, we got a new attribute called prior value. So this means for this date of birth, this was the prior value and this value has been changed to this value. So this way the vendor can identify what is changed and also what was its value before. And if you see, for other fields, the prior value is not appearing because these were never changed. So that is the importance of the prior value attribute. And you can also see here, it also populated the timestamps of our launch parameters. So let me close it. And if you observe, there is one more file that got added when we launch the integration in change detection mode. I mean to say, not full file mode. That is the data changes audit file. This is another important file that you will use to debug any issues. So we have already seen the diagnostic audit. Now let's look at the data changes audit. Let me save, let me open it. Now if you see, the data changes audit tells you what are the timestamps that it used to capture the information, and it also includes the worker details similar to the diagnostic audit file. But the difference here is once you click on this employee, you will see a whole lot of information that will tell you what are the values for that employee, and it will also highlight what was the value that got changed. So that is the beauty of this data changes audit. Whatever the raw file that got generated in the XML format, the same data will be captured here in the tabular format for easy understanding of the user. So this will be very helpful in reading the file and identifying what has been changed rather than going through the raw XML file every time. Okay, so let me close this. Let's see few other things that we can discuss here. If you see the messages tab, this will briefly show what all the history happened on this run. And it also shows for the child processes that it triggered in the backend. So this is how you can create a core connector integration that can run in both full file mode and the change detection mode. And there is one more option which I missed to mention. For example, if you want to test the integration, keep on testing the integration for a specific employee or a group of employees instead of testing it for the whole eligibility population, then in your launch screen, there is an attribute called workers. So here you can select which worker that you can run for. For example, 2004. Let's say I will select this and I want to run it in full file mode again. But when I save it, so let's see, give it a minute. Let's see. Okay. Now it got completed. So now if you see the output file, now if you see here in this run, we ran as the full file mode. That is the reason the data changes audit file did not got generated. So now if I open the output file, see, there is only one worker that we have selected came in the output. So this is how you can test either only for one worker, or if you want to select one organization that has some employees that you want to test for a group of workers, then you can add organization in the launch parameter. Okay. All right. Now let's look at a few other configurations that we can do on the integration system. So this is our integration system. If you go to the related actions, you will be able to see a lot of options in the integration system. The first option is the integration events. Once you click on it, it will open up this window wherein you can try to filter on these parameters, or you can select OK, so that it will display the history of this integration, at what time it ran, who ran, and you can also click on the event link to directly go to that event and access the files. Okay. And another attribute is clone. If you want to clone this integration, make a copy and make modifications to it, you can also clone the integration. And these ones that we already saw, you can configure the attributes, field overrides, maps, and you can also configure notifications. Like for example, when you schedule your integration as a batch job on a daily basis, then in case of failures, you would want to receive a notification either for a single email address or for a group. Then you can do that by configuring the notifications. So here you can select on what status you need to send the notification. You can select all those different status here, and then you can select any worker or any group here. For example, you want to send the notification to integration administrator, then you can select that. Or if you want to send the notification to any mail ID, you can even do that. You can also configure the attachments, and you can also add any text like this. And you can also append existing data fields from the integration so that this text and this field will be combined together and will be sent in the subject. Similarly, you can configure the body as well. We cancel it, and as you can see here, you can also configure the services, transaction log that we all saw, and you can also view some of the other attributes. And in fact, you can delete the integration system as well. Now, let's talk something about the delivery aspect of it and the file naming convention of it. So right now, our integration is generating the file in this format. So if you want to have the file name to be something different, okay? Configuring the sequence generator or the file name. For example, if you have a static file name, for example, let's try to configure one static file name. So if you see in the integration attribute, we have something called output file name. If you add a value here, let's say XYZ vendor dot, for example, I just mentioned like this, and I saved. Now let me try to relaunch my old event and see if the file name has been generated or not. I can go to integration events. I can relaunch directly from here. Go to the integration event, related actions, integration event, relaunch. And as you can see, whatever the parameters, the full file, the worker, it got auto selected. So I can simply say, okay, me refresh, and got completed. Okay. Now, if you go to the output file tab, now you see the name of the file got changed. So previous file name was the standard file name that the connector generates. But if you want a different file name based on the vendor requirement, you can do that. So now let's say the vendor says that along with the file name, customized file name, they also need a date and time stamp when it got generated. So in those cases, we have to add the file name dynamically so that every time it runs, it captures that moment's date and time. And that we will not be able to configure on the integration attributes, because here we will be able to configure only the static value. So what we can do is we need to configure something called integration file sequence generator, file name sequence generator. So this is one of the service we enabled before. You can go ahead and enable it again, and you will be able to see the file name sequence generator service enabled. So let me go to the related actions, go to integration system, and here if you see, you will get the option to configure integration sequence generators. Click on that and it will open up this window. So this is where, okay, I think that is fine. So what I will do is, so here if you see, there are few attributes that you need to select. So increment sequence ID, always keep it as 1. Sequence format, padding, if you want, you can keep it. Otherwise, you can give some format here. Like, for example, if you want to add any date timestamp, here you see, as soon as you hover over it, it will ask you to key in the information based on this syntax. Like, for example, if I want YYYY, then I will have to enter as shown for the year. If you observe closely, square brackets, YYY, and for the month, square brackets, capital M, and for the day, square brackets, D. So you can configure this pattern until milliseconds as well. For time being, let's try to configure this like this: YYYYMMT dot XM. And along with this, I also want to add some static text. Okay. As soon as I added it, it gave me one alert saying that sequence is not included. Again, this is optional, but if you want, you can also add sequence to it so that it generates one unique number every time. That is optional. Now, if you see here, based on the format that we entered here, it gave the sample name, how it will generate. So if I remove the sequence from here, and that alert will come, but as you see here, still it will accept the file name. And this is how the vendor needs it. So I can save this. Now, one more thing, let's say you are debugging in your test environment and you don't want to get confused, or you want to have different formats for your environments. So for example, for production, you want to keep it this format, and for your test, so that you know that is your test environment, you can add one more line item and select your implementation tenant and add something like, for example, if you say, I will add test underscore, so that when it runs in the implementation tenant, our file name will become like this. When it runs in production, the file name will be this. So that is how you can define multiple file names dynamically based on the environment as well. So let's try to save it. It is giving the alert because it says we haven't used the sequence number, but still that is okay. Sequence generator got created. So now let me try to do the same thing, or let me try to maybe launch the integration directly from here. So I'll select full file again. The reason I'm not going with the change detection is because I need to key in a transaction again, or I have to backdate some of these dates and then launch the integration. See, okay? Let's see. Still running. Let me refresh. Got completed. Now, if you see in the output files tab, since we ran this integration in the implementation tenant, it took the sequence generator based on our configuration and it appended test underscore whatever the file name, dynamic file name that it is. So this is how the sequence generators will be useful. Okay. Now, so we have discussed about different attributes, the file names, sequence generators, launch parameters. So one thing I think we need to discuss is about the delivery. So far we have just ran the integration, we got the file, but this file, we are not delivering it anywhere. Ideally, when you schedule this on a daily basis as a batch job, you need to send the file to your vendor system. So for that, you need to configure the delivery setup. So in this demo, we are not going to do the actual delivery configuration, but I will show you how and where to do the configuration. So once everything is ready, which means you have tested your integration and you are making sure that the file is generating correctly, then the last step would be to add the delivery configuration. So to add the delivery step, you will have to create a custom integration business process. So for example, if you see here, when you go to the related actions and view the integration delivery, business process definitions are not there because obviously we haven't created one. So we will have to create a new business process definition and just say, okay, let everything be default in this one. So the A step will be as it is. So leave it. And the B step will be fire integration. You can just leave it as it is. Add one more step with C and select the type as service and specify it as a document delivery. Okay. Now you can save it. Now, once you click on OK, it throws an error saying that the delivery event service is not fully configured. So what this means is that in the C step that we just added, you will have to click on the document delivery and click on OK. So this is where we will configure where the file should be going. So here you can select the documents from integration process, obviously, and optionally, you can also select any tags that we will be using in the integration attributes. Like, for example, let me show you. Go back to the integration CCW. Okay, this error is again on the same delivery that we just added. So we will fix that. And as you see here, as soon as we added the delivery of the business process definition, this tab appeared here so that we can directly go to the business process definition from here. But before that, so here in the output document tags, we can also create a tag and select the tag here so that that specific file can get picked, or we can also leave it empty. That is optional. So here you can say how many times it should attempt to deliver. You can configure that, and you can also select what is the transport type. 99% of the cases, it will be SFTP. So when you select SFTP, it will ask you to enter the SFTP address in this format. So you will enter the SFTP address, you'll enter the directory, and you will enter the authentication type provided by the vendor or the server. Can be username, password, can be SSH authentication, can be dual authentication as well. And then you can also use encryption to encrypt the file that got generated and send the encrypted file to the vendor. You can also restrict from which environment the file should be sent. Typically, it is production. So for a few vendors, we can also enable it in sandbox, but typically it will be in production. That's where we will send the file based on the server configuration. You can similarly add more transport types in case you want to send the same file to multiple locations. So this is how you will send the file to a third-party system. Now, since this error is already there, I need to somehow this. Okay, so for time being, what I will do, let me remove the delivery step so that our integration does not have any errors. So I'll click on business process definition, go here and I will edit the definition. I will click on OK and remove the C step and save it. Okay. Now, if I go back, open the integration system, the error will be gone. There is a small alert and that says delivery service is enabled, but it is not configured. So which is fine. So this is all about configuring, creating, and managing a core connector worker.